Well, thank you all for coming. We have a very special lecture with us today, Professor Robert Anthony Maranto, who's a nationally recognized expert in the area of education reform, and particularly on the topic of school choice. Bob Maranto received his BS in government, not a BA, a BS in government, from the University of Maryland, and his PhD from the University of Minnesota. He is, since 2008, the 21st Century Chair in Leadership in the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas. But prior to that, from 2000 to 2008, I can happily say we were very fortunate to have Bob Maranto here at Villanova in the Department of Political Science. And we've missed him every day since he's been gone. Dr. Maranto is a member of the United States Civil Rights Commission Arkansas Advisory Committee and a member of the Achievement House Charter School Board. He's also a member of about 20 other organizations, but those were the two that I thought we would highlight. Professor Maranto's publications, and there are 19 pages of publications on his vita, or close to it, but a few of these, most recently the Obama presidency, Change and Continuity, which he co-edited with D.C. Van Ramdonk, and The Politically Correct University, which he'll be talking about today, and we have some copies of that book over here for purchase if you're interested. He also co-edited with R.T. Langsford and Jay Johnson, Judging Bush. And then he has on his slate of accomplishments many, many, many articles and books on the issue of educational reform. Professor Maranto is currently working on not one or two or three or four, his colleagues will appreciate this, but I think it was 8 or 9 current projects, book projects that he's working on. One of these is a book entitled The Personal and the Political, President Obama and School Reform. Another one is entitled Breaking Through the Educational Industrial Complex. Now, I was not happy it was raining out today, but I didn't mind too much because I knew that that would mean that Bob Maranto would wear his trench coat. You'll have to have a glimpse of this afterwards because I don't know if it's 1 or 2 sizes too big, but I've always thought all he needed was a cigar in his hand, and we have our own Colombo here at Villanova. Well, so please join me in not simply welcoming, but welcoming back to Villanova, Professor Bob Maranto.
Thanks so much. Can everybody hear me? Is this on? Or can you hear me without it?
No, you'll need a mic.
Yeah, I'll need a mic. I mean, I guess I could go behind the podium. It's more formal, but it works. Colleen, I can't thank you enough for having me here. And I wouldn't have done this book without you. You introduced me to Henry Olson when I originally sort of had the idea. And Henry Olson at AEI gave us a huge grant. And Jason O'Brien, a Villanova alum now at Notre Dame Law School, who was my RA at the time, did a huge amount of work and also got some extra money thanks to the huge grant. Richard Redding, who was in law school at the time and now is off at Chapman University, co-edited it with me and did a great job. And you know, Villanova, you say you were lucky to have me here. I was extremely lucky to be here. I mean, I had done a few years in government and was sort of semi-unemployed and maybe semi-unemployable when Villanova took a chance on me, and I was kind of intending to stay here for 40 years or so, which you know, Arkansas just gave us an offer we couldn't refuse, and we kind of missed the South, and we're doing fun things. But I'll make 2 other quick announcements before I get into why I did this. One is I'm the director of our PhD program in the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas. And to give you our quick pitch, Brenda, you have brochures for that, right? Or in the table in the back. We have an amazing PhD program. We've got some incredible people. Our top fellowships are $32,000 a year plus tuition. And that's kind of nice. We've got a great group of graduate students. The Obama education reform book I've co-authored with one of our grad students. One of our graduate students last year had a book published by Yale University Press. And education is just one of those areas that's changing rapidly, almost before our eyes. I think mostly in good ways. And I think President Obama has done a very good job in facilitating that. You know, so if you want to play a role in reshaping public and maybe ultimately private education over the next 30 years, we would be a great place to go. And I'm glad to talk with any of you about that, or shoot me an email, or call me up or something. The other thing I'll tout is I actually get a really good salary. I mean, you know, it's not like insanely good. It's not like Benjamin Barber makes or something like that, or Jonathan Kozol or something like that. But it is a very good salary. And so usually when I get a speaking fee, I just give it away. But I rarely get speaking fees, actually. So I wanted to give this speaking fee. I'm not Catholic, but I was raised Catholic. I like Catholic institutions a great deal. And something that Catholic institutions really emphasize is the equality of all people. And something that always really bothered me growing up. I grew up in Baltimore County, Maryland. And I knew that if I had been raised about 2 miles east of where I was raised, and if I'd been African American probably, my life chances would have been very different. And probably I would have mouthed off to the wrong person and gotten shot, whereas where I lived, if I got mouthed off to the wrong person, the worst I might get is a slap. And I also knew that my local public schools were not very good. It was a blue-collar neighborhood. Most of the kids didn't go into college. They weren't very good, but they weren't terrible. You know, you could learn to read and write, and you would not get beaten up in them. And if I were raised 2 miles east of where I was raised, that would not have been the case. And so I think when we argue about school choice, it's really kind of a false argument. Most people have school choice. If the local schools are bad, they move, or they send their kids to private schools. Catholic schools are still very cheap. Some other private schools are relatively affordable. People who don't have school choice, by and large, are poor people, and disproportionately people of color. And those are the folks who I think really need it, and the folks who, where public schools aren't very good, frankly get screwed. And an organization that does something about that is the Children's Scholarship Fund. And let me introduce real quick, I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name. Say louder. Natalie Agrouse, and you have forms. You have something that people can give contributions, right?
Certainly.
Okay. So you'll be.
If you would like to support school choice for inner city children in downtown Philadelphia, I'm the one you want to see.
Okay, and they give scholarships out to kids attending low-cost private schools in the city, and I'm mostly Catholic. And I'm giving my speaker's fee plus $500 to that. So I guess it's a negative. This is a negative 500 deal for me. But it's worth it. It's something I think is really important to do, and they do very good work. By the way, Diane Ravitch was the one who first told me about you guys, and she's kind of switched, although she still likes Catholic schools. She just turned against charter schools. Okay, well, how did I get into this? And I'll hold up the book real quick. The Politically Correct University. I think there's nothing wrong with talking about what your ideology is as long as you don't force it on unwilling students. I'm kind of a libertarian Republican. I like small government. I feel like the smaller the government is, the less we'll fight over. So if government controls everything, including health care, including whether health care providers have to do abortions, then we have an awful lot of things that we're going to fight about, and the losers are going to be really mad, and all of us are going to lose a bunch. There's this myth that people talk about that, oh, politics is beautiful because we all come together as one and sing Kumbaya. And anybody who says that is either lying or has never been involved in politics. Politics is chiefly about us versus them. It's about unifying us versus some evil them out there. And what sort of struck me is, and this has been true I think almost my whole life, but it's gotten more and more true, is that academia has become sort of an us for we professors, and the rest of America has become a them. And I think that's very, and for the rest of America, a lot of them think that we in academia are nuts, that we're not part of the planet that they're on. There's a great Tim Grosclose at UCLA just wrote a book, and I have not gone in enough to the methodology to really know how accurate he is, but it seems persuasive, arguing that the media is fairly biased in a liberal direction, and he has measures of this, and he argues it sort of pulls the American people further to the left than they would otherwise be, and makes them somewhat less informed. And he has a funny anecdote where a student at Stanford asked his professor before the 2004 election, he said, how could Bush win this election? I don't understand it. And the professor said, okay, when you fly from New York, where you live, over here to San Francisco or Palo Alto, you see all that territory you fly under with all that green space? You know what's down below there? And he said, what? And the professor said, Republicans. I think there is this tendency for university people and Americans to consider themselves an us versus them. And I do not think it is healthy. I do not think it is healthy at all. Something that I've also always been kind of interested in my life is race relations, which, you know, where I grew up were not terribly good. I think they've generally gotten better over the years. They're quite a bit better, actually. It's kind of funny. We used to have a running argument, but this is taped, right? Okay, I won't tell family stories. Okay, I will not directly. I will say that my wife and I used to argue about whether a particular relative of ours was racist or just snobbish. And he's now engaged. He's white. He's now engaged to an African American. So we've agreed he's snobbish. He's not racist. Race relations often take that form of us versus them. And I think again it's very, very unhealthy. And I think organizations that have done the best to get around that, like the military, are people who have common standards and push people together to work together for common goals. And we in academia, I think, do not do terribly well at that. I think we are very guilty of the us versus them sort of politics. By the way, listening to NPR yesterday, as I almost always do, and they talked about Barney Frank is now retiring. He's a brilliant guy. He's an interesting guy to listen to. But they said, well, he can be very funny. And they had an example of him telling off a constituent, made a, I thought, rather disparaging comment about Obamacare. And Frank said, well, I see no more reason to talk to you than I would at table, because that's how stupid you are. And NPR thought that was kind of funny. And I thought, gosh, you know, imagine if a Republican had said that to a liberal constituent. NPR might have talked about the terrible incivility in politics and how awful things are, and we don't respect constituents and all those kinds of things. As indeed they did when just last week the governor of Kansas did something kind of like that. So anyway, I think it's good to try to get beyond that. Anyway, how did I get into this book? And by the way, a colleague of mine in the audience, who I love dearly, he's a liberal Democrat, I will not say who it is, when I was working on this, he said, Bob, why are you working on that stab us in the back book instead of producing ever more social science that nobody reads? And I said, well, first off, you know, universities are interesting. I mean, I like universities. I think they're kind of interesting and fun. And it is an interesting phenomena that university faculty, especially in the social sciences and the humanities, the areas where ideology actually counts. I mean, honestly, who cares if physical education professors are mostly Republican? It doesn't really matter much. The areas where ideology counts, they're overwhelmingly to the left. And doesn't that in some ways stall our education? And actually, as Tim Grosclose puts it, he has a funny line from the Blues Brothers. When Elwood Blues is going to play at Bob's Country and Western Bar, he asks Bob, what kind of music do you play here? And he says, oh, son, we play both kinds of music, country and Western. And Grosclose says, well, if you look at universities, it's kind of like we have both kinds of ideology, liberal and progressive. But, you know, we may not have a greater variety. And I think that means that we're missing something. And I have a lot of, you know, sort of fun anecdotes about that. A sociologist I interviewed years back, he's unfortunately passed away now. He told me that when he said, when I became a Republican, it was a sensation in the department. It was as if I became a child molester. You don't want to be in a department where everyone hates your guts. And so he then went off into government. And his wife, in some ways, actually had it even worse. And it sort of struck me years back, actually the year that Villanova hired me, I had a job interview at a fairly prominent school of public policy. And I did something kind of dumb because I had 3 job interviews coming up, so I was pretty confident I'd get something. As it turned out, I landed the best job, the Villanova job. That other one paid better. You know, I casually mentioned at one point, well, it was 2000. I said, yeah, I'll probably vote for Bush this fall. And the whole tenor of the interview changed. And I thought, yeah, I don't think I'm going to get this job. And I talked to a friend of mine internally. He said, that department will never hire a Republican. You know, so they hired somebody who published about a third what I had, but it was apparently a better fit. You know, and hopefully it worked out for them. Ironically enough, one of my PhD students, very, very bright guy, is now applying for 2 different positions at the same university, one in that same department. And I've kind of gone, and he's actually a right-wing, very religious Christian, and I mean, he's witness to me and so on. And I said, no, thank you, but you know, I'm glad you're really enthused about it. I think it's a great thing. And I told him, all right, if you're going to apply here, here's what you need to do. You know, and he's gone with the program, and you know, he's got a shot. We'll see if he gets it. His name is James. The other, I mean, the kind of bigger thing, the biggest impetus for this, probably for this book, is that I was at the Brookings Institution in 1992, And then I was working for the Clinton administration. I wasn't in the administration, I was below the political level, but I worked a lot with Clinton political appointees and liked them a great deal, almost without exception. Laura Brown, you were an appointee, although I didn't know you at the time. Actually, Marwan, were you in the Clinton years? Okay, you came later. And what struck me in working with all these Washington Democrats was, I mean, first off, they were really, on the whole, good people. They were good public servants. They were smart. They were patriotic. And secondly, what I found was I really agreed with them on 70 or 80% of things. And I really ideologically felt pretty comfortable with them. Whereas in academia, I'm like a crazy raging right-winger. And I thought, well, this is a very interesting phenomenon. I said, there's a book in this, right? And so that was kind of the biggest thing that sort of led me to go down this road. Now, the other sort of proximate cause was about, and he's been doing this in various ways for 20-some years, but it's gotten really big the last 7 or 8 years, I guess. David Horowitz, very brilliant guy. Chris Lillick, I guess, when he was a student here, brought him in at least once to speak. And Horowitz has made a career. Originally, he was a radical left-winger. He gradually moved to the right, partly after the Black Panthers murdered a friend of his, and partly as he became convinced that the liberal, these far-left ideas just didn't work. And so by the mid-'80s, he was sort of a raging conservative, and sort of built up this whole sort of set of institutions. FrontPageMagazine.com is kind of interesting to read. He's got the Center for Study of the Popular Culture. He's got some other things. And he started coming out with lots of books attacking academia. And so if you were to read David's stuff, you would think that the average professor were some kind of Leninist, that somebody like Ward Churchill at the University of Colorado, who got in trouble initially because after the 9/11 attacks, he said, well, that was a good thing. They took out a bunch of little Eichmanns in the financial community, which oddly enough, people were offended by this statement. And he had been head of Native American Studies at the University of Colorado and a fairly prominent figure. And that led to people actually looking into his scholarship and finding out that much of it was plagiarized. And then they looked into his personal life. He had gotten a lot out of being a Native American. Well, the tribe he claimed to belong to, I think it was, I can't remember if it was the Cheyenne or Northern Arapaho, I think it was one of the two. They had said for years, no, he's not one of us, he's a regular Anglo guy, we didn't know this guy. He claimed to have fought in Vietnam, he had not. He basically had fabricated his entire career, and because he was kind of an imposing figure, very good at getting radical students to protest, he had worked that into an entire career, basically based on falsehoods, making a nice six-figure income, etc. And so that was his downfall. David Horowitz would have you believe that Ward Churchill was the typical professor, and he's not. Most professors are not nuts, and they're not self-serving, or at least not that self-serving, and they're not evil, and which I think maybe he was. On the other hand, maybe he's not evil, maybe he's just a profit-seeking prophet. I mean, I've noticed that a lot of people on the far left, Jonathan Kozol gets $20,000 a speech. I don't think he ever gives any of it to the Children's Scholarship Fund or to public schools or anything else. But I can't blame a guy. He's got a good business model. It works for him. I believe in business. But I'm not really sure I would pay to have him come to my university. And I definitely wouldn't pay to have Ward Churchill come. So anyway, so I thought there's something here that I could do something really interesting. And what also struck me was Horowitz, first off, I thought he was overstating the problem. He was overstating just how left-wing academia is and how unprofessional academia is. And most academics, it's been my experience, are professional. They have academic standards. They're not nuts. They don't want to impose a socialist revolution. And even those who do generally have academic standards and generally don't take out their ideals on their students. Generally, not always, at least not purposely. They may accidentally. But the other thing that struck me about David Horowitz was, and he's a brilliant guy, and I'm really glad he's out there, because he's out there, I get to be the moderate. I get to be the guy like, hey, I'm not crazy, I like academia. So, David, he's the guy you should hate. I'm not the guy you should hate. So David gives me running room. The other thing David has, I think is wrong, is when he argues for an academic Bill of Rights, saying that you cannot discriminate against students or faculty based on their ideology. In theory, that sounds great, right? Who could possibly be against that? In practice, I think it is a horrendously bad idea. I mean, I'm not really thrilled with the whole protected classes notion anyway. I think it tends to divide people more than it unites them. But, at times it may be necessary. I mean, the country does have quite a legacy of racial discrimination. In particular, I think at times the protected classes notion can be justified. I don't want to extend it very far because it will be abused. And so if you right off the bat say that ideology is a protected class, then every time I give a student a C, they're going to say, well, you didn't like my ideology, you know, and they will have sympathetic administrators who will defend what they're doing. And I, as a faculty member, could get in trouble. And I don't see any way you can do that without having a real watering down of academic standards. And David, first off, kind of really dislikes universities, but second off, I think he doesn't really understand them. He doesn't really understand how they work. And I, you know, Richard Redding and Rick Hess and I, we kind of understand universities, and we kind of like them, actually. We think they need reform, but we don't think they need tearing down. So I was like, okay, so we've got David Horowitz. There is a problem. There is a PC problem at universities, but it's not nearly as bad as David says. So there's a niche kind of on the center. At the same time, if you look on the left, people deny there's any problem, and conventional university administrators and leaders deny there's any problem. So the American Association of University Professors, for example, denies that there's any problem at all. And I think that's clearly wrong. Yeah, that's about as wrong as David is. And so I said, well, this gives me a pretty broad area to run with, and I can really have fun with this. So I thanks to Colleen, I sat down with Henry Olson at the American Enterprise Institute and Richard Redding, and Rick Hess also played a big role. And we solicited a bunch of chapter writers to explore the whole PC university phenomena in as systematic a way as we could. By the way, as far as I know, we've only had one review, and that was in the New York Times Online, where the far left scholar Stanley Fish praised us. And I'm kind of mad at my publisher because I kept saying, hey, Stanley Fish said we're good. You need to, like, you know, we could sell some books here. And they haven't done it, so, oh well. But but anyway, the first part of the book, we just kind of look at the numbers. And Dan Klein and Charlotta Stern have a wonderful chapter looking at a whole bunch of surveys of academics going back decades and decades. And you know, they find that academia is overwhelmingly to the left, or well, liberal or far left. And it's gotten more so over time. At least it got a lot more so from the 60s to the mid-80s. You know, since then it's kind of stalled some, partly because there just aren't, you know, once you get down to like 3 or 4% Republicans, I mean, really you can't go much lower in some fields. And it varies a lot by field. Again, fields that are more applied are much more balanced. A couple of fields, I mean, finance by some surveys is actually half and half. Accounting is half and half, or by some surveys even slightly more Republican than Democrat. But in general, the natural sciences are pretty heavily Democratic, and the social sciences and humanities, that is the areas where ideology really matters, are way to the left. And it varies by field. Sociology, depending on the survey, it could be 20 to 1, it could be 40 to 50 to 1. It depends on what measure you look at. Anthropology, same thing. Sort of women's studies, gender studies, they don't look at that, but I think those would probably be even more imbalanced. Political science, relatively moderate, maybe 6.5 to 1, somewhere in there. There is a significant conservative presence for reasons that Jim Caesar and I explain in the chapter we write. It's actually a pretty open field, we argue. Of course, our field, we kind of like it. The economics, the one really conservative part of the social science, is depending on which survey numbers you use, probably something like 2.5 to 1, maybe 3 to 1 Democrat to Republican. And that's considered a real crazy right-wing / libertarian field. The other thing that Klein and Stern point out is that Democrats in academia tend to be very liberal Democrats. Republicans in academia tend to be pretty moderate. And you know, so they're not supporting Michelle Bachmann, you know, whereas you know, Democrats in academia might well be supporting Michael Moore, or, you know, if she were running Maxine Waters or something like that, or Dennis Kucinich. And that kind of makes sense, because Republicans in academia are going to be surrounded by people who are questioning their views, which will ideally get them to question their views and maybe change some of their views. And Democrats, unfortunately, aren't so much, except to the degree that students question it. And I think that really puts liberals in academia at a disadvantage. It makes them more prone to groupthink. It makes them more prone to you know, believing kind of silly things. The Republicans are. Republicans in academia, it's a lot harder if you're a Republican in academia to believe something really silly. Not that none of them ever do, but it's harder. The balance is also, the imbalance is stronger at the more prestigious schools. So if you look at the Harvard Political Science Department, one Republican there, and everybody knows who he is, Harvey Mansfield. There was going to be a second one, and Amy Gutman pulled all kinds of strings in terms of stacking committees to make sure that he wouldn't get tenure, and that's all online. You can look at it, and which I thought was pretty duplicitous behavior that contradicted merit. And but again, I can't really say that Amy Gutman's a dumb person, because look, she was rewarded with the presidency of Princeton. And my own view is people will tend to do what gets rewarded. So I'm not blaming Amy Gutman for this. If you look at say Stanford, it's Stanford is 22-1 in political science. UC San Diego, very good department, is 27-0, perfect shutout. And and I don't think that's necessarily a good thing for either the faculty or the students at these places. I think that more diversity would be a good thing. Just as if their faculty were all white male, I think that would be probably not a great thing. They would probably be missing a few things. Now let me look at some other things I wanted to look at there. Oh yeah, UCLA 45-4, etc. And again, that actually understates the differences just because academic Republicans tend to be more in the center. Harvey Mansfield's a notable exception, but generally they are. Now, why is there this imbalance? And there are at least 7 views, probably more than 7. One is that some argue it's really not that much of an imbalance. And methodologically, the only people who find that, I think, are Gross and Simmons and Smith et al. And their methodology is, I think, highly questionable. They do things like they ask academia, well, are you liberal, conservative, or moderate? Why is that kind of a dumb way to do it? Well, if I go to a Nazi party rally and ask people, some of them will say they're conservative, some will say they're liberal, some will say they're moderate, right? People are placing themselves in relationship to their peers. So, I mean, if I'm a member of the Nazi Party or the Communist Party, I might call myself a moderate, whereas all the rest of us would say, you're crazy. And so this is probably not a good methodology. They also look at junior college professors who do tend to be a little more conservative. And, and I guess if you think that Delaware County Community College is as important as the University of Pennsylvania, that makes sense. But how many of us really think that in the scheme of things? Which place has more influence in the national conversation? I mean, so I think this methodology is highly questionable. When you actually look at people's opinions on actual issues and how they register to vote and who they vote for, you get very, very different results. By the way, one thing they do that's very cute, they lumped center-right people, center-left people, and center-center people on a 1 to 7 scale together. And they see there's lots of moderates. They don't look at the fact that the center-left people outnumber the center-right people like 7 to 1, which I think is kind of relevant here. So I think this is sort of questionable scholarship. Now, some people argue that, okay, academia does lean way to the left, but it's because conservatives are dumb. And I wrote a piece in the Washington Post that you can look up online. As a Republican, I'm something or other, I can't remember what it was. It's kind of a funny piece I did back in 2007. And when I did it, I immediately set up a new email account because I knew I'd get deluged. And so I put my new Gmail account in there, and I got 234 responses, which were really flaky. I never did read all of them. I read about a third of them. And they were kind of depressing, actually. The right-wingers were really paranoid and really hated academia, and the left-wingers were often even worse. And a typical left-winger one is kind of, well, higher ed faculty tend to be engaged and concerned individuals, well, smart. And this type of people naturally react negatively to the term conservative or Republican. And similarly, a spelling and grammar challenge Berkeley graduate student wrote, when almost all the world's brilliant, well-read people hold a set of views that modern pork-fest Republicans are the worst hypocrites, he misspelled hypocrites, and almost all the most ignorant, superstitious people, misspelled superstitious, religious people hold an opposing set of views that they are patriots. Then there's a conclusion begging to be made. And I thought, okay, so Republicans are all stupid. This, to me, suggests a real disengagement from America and a real disengagement from the world of ideas. Where, most people say, look at the presidencies, who would say Ronald Reagan was actually a pretty good president who accomplished a lot of things. And most people who look at central planning would say, look, we don't buy our cars from Cuba or North Korea. And, there don't seem to be lots of Americans trying to get into those places. Michael Moore notwithstanding. And so I think there are reasons to think that, welfare reform, which a lot of people criticized at the time, which was done by Bill Clinton in a Republican Congress, most people now admit seems to have done a lot more good than harm. Now, I think it was a risky policy, and it's interesting, I will admit we're quicker to take risks with poor people than with old people, which I think is not quite right. But that said, it seemed to have worked. It was not, as one prominent political scientist called it at the time, the equivalent to the Nazi Holocaust. So I think that these are unfortunately people who are just cut off from the real world of ideas. And because they're cut off from it, frankly, I don't want them teaching my kids. I want people teaching my kids who are engaged with a lot of different ideas from a range of places. And there are certainly a lot of right-wingers who are intolerant and only know their own little thing. But in academia, they're way outnumbered by left-wingers who are that way. And I think it's really not healthy. Now there's a third view of why this is, which is it's leftist oppression, the sort of David Horowitz view. And that's not always wrong. I mentioned the Peter Berkowitz tenure case at Harvard. There was the Bradford Wilcox's tenure case at the University of Virginia is hilarious. I mean, look it up online. It's really funny. The sociology department said, well, we don't want a conservative Christian in this department. They said that, and they wrote it down like idiots. So, naturally that was overturned. I mean, the guy had 2 books out with Princeton. He was clearly a very good scholar. He's a good teacher. So he's still there. Rick Hess had published at the University of Virginia, had published more than everyone else who came up at the same time, all 3 of them, and nonetheless was turned down for tenure initially. There are here and there some flaky things going on, but I don't think that's necessarily typical. I think that, maybe in sociology it is. I think in most fields are not that wacky. And I don't think Horowitz has necessarily proven that. I also think David has a book called The 100 Most Dangerous Professors in America, and I think it's kind of a silly book. He basically takes things students wrote in that who knows how accurate they are. I actually know one of the guys who made the list, and I like him. He's a nice guy. I actually think he's a pretty good teacher. I kind of don't think he deserved a couple of 100 flaming emails saying that you're an evil un-American and all that. I think if conservatives want liberals to practice civility, probably it would be good if we practiced it too. So I think the Horowitz critique is not entirely right. John Agresto actually has a very good chapter in our book, and I think he has a somewhat better critique, which is that it's the nature of the liberal arts in particular to question. And in a center-right society, we should expect it to question lots of center-right practices, and I think there's something to that. And I would always expect academia to be somewhat to the left of where America is generally, and I think that's fine. I have no problem with that. I don't think that having a field that's 40-to-1 to the left, though, is healthy. I'm not even sure 6-to-1 is healthy, but I know 40-to-1 isn't healthy. But John raises a good point. The AAUP raises a couple of points, and one of them I'll talk about in a bit is that conservatives make different lifestyle choices. And they may be right about that. Now, in proposing that, the AAUP had no data at all. They just proposed this to be true. And I would say, just because you're the AAUP doesn't mean you get to defy the laws of science. I mean, give me some data. Don't just tell me this is our prejudice, therefore it must be right. You wouldn't accept that if a conservative were doing it. You shouldn't do it either. But as it turns out, there actually is something to that, as I'll get to in a couple of minutes. But that's not all the story. Now, the second AAUP argument, and I would urge you to look up Freedom in the Classroom, which the AAUP issued about 5 years back. The AAUP says, I have a cute little quote here, that, really the charge of lack of balance invokes a seeming ideal of neutrality, that we should engage all relevant points of view. But that's really silly, because if we try to do that, we would have to give equal time for Nazism and Stalinist communism, and that's just silly. We can't do that. That's one of the stupidest statements I have ever heard intelligent people make. Why is that a really dumb statement? Let me give an example of that. All right, I actually kind of support affirmative action. I think I think it can be overdone, but I think in general it's a good thing. People who oppose affirmative action will say, well, that means you have to have an equal number of Slovenians and an equal number of Sicilians and an equal number of Christian Scientists and so on. And why is that really, I think, not necessarily a good argument? What I would say is, it's a matter of degree. I mean, you could say that, yeah, there are divisions in society. It's healthy if those divisions are represented to some degree, versus taking it to its crazy extreme. And what I would tell the AAUP, what I did tell in this book and elsewhere, is look, okay, I hate to break it to you guys, but Mitt Romney is not Hitler, okay? And Barack Obama is not Stalin. And if you think they are, then I do not want you teaching my children, because then you simply lack judgment. You do not understand what evil is, as opposed to what disagreement is. Hitler and Stalin were evil. I mean, 40 million corpses. Marxism in the last century produced, people argue, it could be 82 million corpses, could be closer to 100 million. It looks pretty evil to me. There are different variations of Marxism. Some are not that way, and I think maybe should be represented at universities. Nazism, I think it's harder to make a case for. but there are some ideas that are just plain evil and stupid, and I don't think they should be represented at universities. But I do not think the leaders of the Democratic and Republican parties in this country are evil or stupid. Al-Qaeda is evil and stupid. Hamas, when you say, let's kill all the Jews, I think that's evil and stupid. But I don't think that Mitt Romney or Barack Obama are anywhere near there. And I would want people teaching my children to have some sense of perspective and to understand that. Or maybe they shouldn't be teaching them. Sounds very judgmental, I guess it is. A final sort of argument for the imbalance is the George Stigler thesis. Oh, by the way, I'm sorry, the AAUP sometimes says, well, ideas don't matter anyway. Again, if you think ideas don't matter, then I do not want you at a university. You know, there's a lot of other jobs for you. Sell insurance, sell real estate. Well, you can't anymore, but you can still sell insurance. You know, go to law school. The lawyers have ideas. Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. The lawyers have ideas. It's unfair. There's a lot of non-ideological jobs you can have. Be an auto mechanic. You make good wages. You do something useful. If you think ideas don't matter, I do not want you at a university. Ideas do matter. They matter at the very least in terms of what questions you ask, as I'll talk about. They matter a lot. And if you think they don't, I think this is the wrong line of work for you. Okay, there's finally the George Stigler thesis, which is that, which Louis Menand, a Harvard English professor, had a very good book about 2 years back, The Academic Marketplace, I think it was called, that made the same points in somewhat greater detail. That basically becoming a faculty member is like joining a fraternity. There's a very, very long hazing ritual that starts with 5 or 6 or 7 years of graduate school. I think it's 9 years in my case. And then you become a junior faculty member for 5 or 6 years before you get tenure. So basically maybe 10 years where you have to sort of mimic the ideas of your superiors if you are sure you want to get tenure. And this tends to lead academics not to just train the next generation of academics, but to clone them. This really punishes people who may have different ideas or different approaches, and I think there's something to that. And it's not that faculty are evil, that faculty are saying you have to think this way. It's very subtle, and I think faculty probably usually don't mean to give that message, but they do a lot of times. And you know, if you have a certain set of ideas, it'll be easier to publish than if you have a different set of ideas. And so over time, that has an unhealthy impact in making academia ideologically very uniform. And I think there's something to that. In fact, one of the better chapters in our book is the Klein and Stern chapter, where they look at academic groupthink and how that develops. And I urge you to read that. So I think there is something to that. Yeah. Okay, Eddie, so why? I just said, you know, one reason is, there's the second thing that George Stigler says, and Louis Menand says too, which is that academic uniformity got a lot worse in the 1970s and 80s. Why was that? Menand argues, and Stigler actually says kind of the same thing, but back in the 60s, there was a huge demand for professors. Colleges were expanding very rapidly. Any new PhD could get a job. Any new PhD who was any good at all could get a job somewhere, probably at a fairly good place. Very suddenly, between 1972 and 1976, everything changed. Graduate schools had ramped, especially in the humanities and social sciences, graduate schools had ramped up the numbers of PhDs they produced radically, partly because of government funding, partly as a prestige race. At the same time, universities stopped growing because, you know, there stopped being as many baby boomers. And so suddenly, you know, in 1972, any fool could get a job. Suddenly by 1976, a friend of mine told me this, there was a new history PhD from Harvard who was begging to get a job at a satellite campus at the University of South Carolina, begging to. In 4 years, everything changed. It went from being a great seller's market, where a good PhD candidate might have 5 or 6 different offers, to where each job might have 150 or 200 applicants. Now, what happens when you have that change? You get a hiring committee. And the way committees work is, the way you get a job in academia, to some degree, it's a blackball system. If any one member of the committee really hates somebody, they can usually knock them out. Now, any 5, 6, 7 person academic hiring committee is probably going to have one pretty left-wing person who will try to veto anybody who looks like they might be conservative. And one is all it takes. And they probably won't have a conservative who would do the same thing, because there aren't enough conservatives to do it. And what Menand, and it's not just ideology, it could be all kinds of other things, all kinds of other reasons why you blackball people. He's a Harvard person, they have a different approach, you know, all those different, well, he's a number cruncher, we don't need another one of those, et cetera, et cetera. You know, ideology is probably one of the lesser ones. But nonetheless, that change in the academic marketplace pushed people to be more and more conforming. And the fact that every assistant professor knows that they can be very, very easily replaced. And if they are replaced, they may not find another job in academia. That's had, I think, a very unhealthy effect on academia and made academia more single-minded. Okay, so these are some of the reasons why. Now, Now, some of them I've already talked about. Let's say empirically in our book, we sort of look at them. One thing we find is that conservatives aren't dumb. When you look at the GPAs of conservative and liberal undergraduates, they're identical. Moderates are actually a little dumber. But apparently all these liberal professors are giving good grades to conservative students, which first off says they're probably not that biased, but second off it indicates the conservatives probably in fact are not dumb, unless they're better at cheating or something, which I haven't seen any evidence for. By the way, something that they would tell you much, Arthur Brooks has done some good work on this. Conservatives give way more money to charity than liberals do, way more. And exactly how you control for everything else, you get different numbers. But a conservative and a liberal at the same income level, the conservative gives way more money. And that to me kind of makes sense. If you're a liberal, it's more likely to be kind of you and the state. And you think the state should take care of things, right? And those people who don't want higher taxes, they're free riders or something. If you're conservative, though, the world is much more complicated. It's you, it's your religion, it's your community, it's your family, and it's your state. And there are all these different things weighing upon you, and that actually seems to make you a more secure person and also a more charitable person. And so it's kind of interesting. I've seen liberals and conservatives talk about this when they're married to each other, and the conservatives, yeah, we really should give this money to charity, it's a good thing. And they're like, no, we have to take care of ourselves because the government's not going to take care of us. And it's kind of a different way to approach things. Similarly, there's a few conservatives who are simple-minded. Jonathan Haidt at the University of Virginia, who's a liberal Democrat, has done very good work. And what Jonathan finds is that for liberals, at least on the far left, they tend to have one overriding value, which is equality. Conservatives have a lot of different values. They have equality, but they also have freedom, they also have tradition, and that actually makes them, when they confront an issue like gay marriage, they're much more conflicted about it. And they actually have more trouble making up their minds, is what at least Jonathan's research seems to show. So no, it's not the conservatives are dumb. That's not the reason why they don't go and get PhDs. We have actually a very, very good chapter in here by Matthew Wisner at Penn State Harrisburg and his wife April Kelly Wisner. By the way, he's a conservative Jew. She's a liberal. I think she's kind of an agnostic, but she was raised Catholic. And they're hilarious. They're just a hilarious couple. You should actually get them to come give a talk here sometime. They're just funny. She's the department chair at Elizabethtown College. And they look at this and they find that there is a big difference, though, that basically, and I'll spin this in a conservative way, conservatives love their families and liberals don't. And what do I mean by that? Conservatives don't want to, what do you have to do to go to a top PhD program? Well, maybe go like 1,000 miles away from home. It's like if you're a Baltimore Orioles fan and you love your family and you love your community, leaving Baltimore could be a very, very difficult thing to go off to the University of Minnesota or Stanford or wherever. If you're a liberal, your personal ties are somewhat weaker and you're more likely to make that jump. The other thing they find is that liberal students are much more likely to say that a key reason, conservatives are likely to say a key reason to go to college is to get a better income so I can raise a family. They want to go out, get married, have kids. That's their values. Liberals are more likely to say they're going to college to find a meaningful philosophy of life, which is a concept that conservatives refer to as religion. So they've kind of already got it in some ways. And those differences do, to a considerable degree, explain why more liberals go into academia than conservatives are. But there are some additional reasons. Conservatives are much less likely, even controlling for GPA, to be asked to do research with their professors. And they're somewhat less likely to spend informal time with their professors. In effect, they get less mentoring. And so I think that's a reason, too, where academia probably, I think, should do a better job if they actually want to get a little more diverse. The other, actually, it's something that the Wisners say is that if academia became more family-friendly, have more daycare and stuff like that, and emphasize just how family-friendly it is, you can get more conservatives to sign up. There's something else. If you go to a PhD program and then be an assistant professor, you might be talking about 10 years before you're really secure in your occupation. And those are prime childbearing years. So if you say, I want to put off having a kid till you're 33, liberals are like, no problem. Conservatives are like, no, I really want to have kids. They're less likely to want to do that. And so if there are ways that we can make the academic occupation more family-friendly, paradoxically, that would encourage more women to go into academia. There's a lot of evidence that women are underplaced. It would also get a lot more conservatives to go into academia. It's a very interesting argument that should appeal to both the left and the right, I would think. Some other things that we find out. We do find that there does seem to be some bias, just plain bias, against conservative faculty. The biggest, if you want to get a good academic job, the biggest thing that will, and keep it, the biggest thing that will help you is publication. Unfortunately, it's not teaching. I wish it were. By the way, one thing we find is conservative faculty tend to take teaching a little more seriously and research a little less seriously. That may partly explain why they're underplaced. But the biggest thing, explaining where you are, is publication. So publication is the coin of the realm. That may not be fair, but it is what it is. And what Rothman and Lichter have a great data set. They actually look at conservative and liberal faculty in number of publications. And what they find is, for economically conservative faculty, there's no impact. But for socially conservative faculty, people who say have qualms about gay marriage or abortion, they seem to be systematically underplaced. And social conservatism actually has about a third of the explanatory power of your publication record. So it's your publication record's most important, but there is some evidence that conservatives are facing, some statistical evidence, with lots of anecdotal evidence, but there's some actual statistical evidence that conservatives are being discriminated against in academic job markets and probably in tenure decisions. And they probably know it. I mean, I don't think a lot of conservatives are saying, gosh, I don't want to be at Harvard. I really want to be at, the University of Southern Arkansas. That's where I want to be. I don't think too many conservatives are saying that. A few are, but I kind of doubt it. Harvard, no good deer hunting there. So we do find evidence of discrimination. That is clearly part of what's going on. So that's empirically kind of what we find. Then we look at individual disciplines, and here again, political science isn't that bad for lots of reasons I could go into. History and linguistics are really pretty bad. One of the best chapters in the book is by John McWhorter, who writes a brilliant linguistics chapter. We unfortunately don't have a foreign policy chapter. I think we really need one. So I kind of explain why this is. By the way, another thing that's probably hurt conservatives some is the rise of administration. The number of administrators over the last 40 years has increased a lot faster than the number of faculty, way faster. There's actually more administrators and staff at college campuses now than there are faculty, which I think is a problem. And administrators, at least a book that I read that just came out a few months ago, Benjamin Ginsberg. Ginsberg's a left-wing guy, he's not a conservative. In The Fall of the Faculty, Ginsberg argues that this plethora of administrators has sort of used political correctness to empower themselves. To kind of, and it's a very, and it's the argument some of our folks make as well, that if you can kind of ally yourself with gender studies or black studies or something, you can use that to increase your power on campus and potentially defang the rest of the faculty. It's a very interesting argument, and it kind of, conservatives actually don't play in it much. Mostly it deals with sort of liberal versus far left faculty versus administrators. Anyway, does all this matter? And one thing that we find is most faculty, at least in political science, the Wisners are doing great work on this. In political science, the evidence is that most political scientists do not systematically discriminate against Republicans. A few do. Their estimates are about 8%, which is higher than we'd like. I mean, I would say, what if we found that 8% of employers didn't like African Americans? That would bother us a little bit, right? I think it would. But it's not nearly as bad a problem as, say, David Horowitz makes it out to be. So it may hurt undergraduate teaching a little bit, not as much as they say. I actually think it hurts undergraduate teaching in a different way. It's not grading, but it's more what ideas you're exposed to. I taught adjunct a couple times at a very good liberal arts college that I will not name, but it's not that far away. And I perused their list of speakers once, and I said, gosh, you could go 2 years here and never have a right of center speaker, which is why places like the Ryan Center are very useful and important, I think. That's not healthy. It means you're not being exposed to a broad range of ideas. Similarly, if you look at people's syllabi, if you look at what's required in the bookstores, overwhelmingly left-wing perspective. And that's not to criticize the faculty necessarily. As Tim Grosclose puts it, a fish doesn't realize that they're living in water. If you're surrounded by people who are just like you, naturally you have no bias, right? But you are. There is a bias. You're missing something. And I think that limits the ideas that students are exposed to. And in that way, I think it does hurt undergraduate teaching. It also hurts, I think, in ways that are maybe even more insidious. One way it hurts academia is in terms of legitimacy. Obama's not a good example. All right, actually, he is a good example. If President Bush had an all-white cabinet, African Americans, I think understandably, might feel a little slighted. If President Obama had an all-black cabinet, I think white folks, understandably, might feel a little slighted, right? Divisions that matter in society, it is healthy if those divisions are represented in some ways in social institutions, or those social institutions can become really disconnected from society, as I think academia to some degree has. Most Americans increasingly don't trust academia, and when we find something out, they don't trust it. Because, a bunch of crazy liberals, you can't trust them. And they discount it, and I think that's not healthy. And I think it hurt us in the Iraq War, for example, where I think things would have been done more sensibly if there was more openness to other points of view. So it hurts the legitimacy of academia. I think it hurts academia even more maybe in producing good citizens. We've kind of given up on teaching American history, something conservatives care a lot about. And people on the far left care about it too, but just in terms of teaching the ills of American history. And America has a lot of ills. I think every country does. I mean, you know, my family is mixed race by marriage. And so we're trying to explain to my 7-year-old last week why Aunt Veronica's family, like 150 years ago, might have been sold into slavery, you know, ironically enough, by the ancestors of my wife. And you know, we're like, yeah, you know, people, they didn't know any better back then. They were good people, but they just didn't know any better. They thought that blacks weren't people. How could they think that? Aunt Veronica's a person like us. I know, but they just didn't know that back then. And you know, and I'm like, look, if you went back 150 years, the vast majority of countries practiced slavery. I mean, Saudi Arabia got rid of it in 1962, for heaven's sake. You know, America is a very sinning country, but every country is. And I think it would be healthy if we had nuanced views of American history that would show that yeah, we have a few things to be ashamed of. We also have an awful lot of things to be proud of, which is why there's a huge line of people trying to get into the country and no line of people trying to leave, something that I think as Americans we should be kind of proud of. So I think we do a bad job of producing good citizens, and that shows in all kinds of ways. We've given up teaching basic facts, and that to some degree is a problem of the ed schools. David teaches basic facts. If you ask, what's his name, at Claremont McKenna, right-wing political scientist, so there's a few of them there. I can't believe I'm blanking on his name. Anyway, he has a very good fact-based American government textbook that's just out. And he has this game. He asks liberal students, where does all the government money go? And they all think he goes to defense. My brother, who has a master's degree, knows he's really smart. He's really smarter than most people. He knows that 70% of public spending goes to defense. I'm like, well, Rick, actually you're off by 50%. It's about 20% of federal government. Actually, you could zero out the defense budget and we would still have a deficit. Okay, so that ain't going to do it. But that's kind of typical of how liberals view things. Conservatives, on the other hand, think all the money goes to welfare and foreign aid. Which, you know, foreign aid is less than 1%. You said your students said 2%, right? That's actually pretty good. Most Americans think it's way higher. And the welfare, it's true. If you're talking about entitlements to old people, that's about half the federal, well, not half. It's over 40% of the federal budget. If you're talking about total entitlements, it's like 55%. So that is closer to the truth. But most of that doesn't go to poor people. It goes to middle-class people. I mean, we could leave aid to the poor untouched and solve the budget deficit without that much difficulty. So why don't politicians do it? Because we educators do not produce citizens who know the basic facts. I mean, in my ideal world, we would have institutions, I don't know, let's call them schools and colleges, and they would teach people the facts they know to be good citizens. And strangely enough, that's a more conservative point of view than a liberal point of view, because the liberal point of view tends to be, well, these damn fools are uneducable, so we have to just give more power to the hands of elites. And I don't think that's a good idea in the long run. So I think it hurts in that way. I think a big way it hurts is in boredom. If universities are about, and probably administrators are more to blame for this than PC people are. If universities are just about giving people credentials to get jobs, they're pretty boring places. You know, I think that a good university should have lots of debates, should have lots of arguments about things. My university, University of Arkansas, did something remarkable 2 weeks ago. The law school held a debate on executive power. And the same week, the student union had a debate on gay marriage. And darn it, I had to babysit both nights, so I couldn't go to them. But I think that is just so cool. I mean, one message that sends is that people can disagree about very sensitive issues and still consider each other human beings. And I think that's something we too often get away from. And I think the final problem with not having somewhat diverse faculty is that of fear. If only a narrow range of views are acceptable, then people are afraid of straying outside that narrow range. And sometimes people will use that to get each other. And I'm told people at some conservative Christian universities might use it in their way. More often at mainstream universities might be so-and-so is racist or sexist, which is usually, not always, sometimes it's real. Usually I think it's a bogus claim just to kind of get people you want to get. Just like back in the McCarthy era, if you wanted to get somebody, you would say, oh, they're a communist, you know. Which is a very difficult thing to disprove. You know, if you define communism really broadly, or if you define racism and sexism really broadly, you can get almost anybody at almost any time for almost anything. And I think that has not helped the climate at universities. And I think if we had more ideological diversity, more acceptance that people of goodwill could hold different ideas, there would be less ability for highly manipulative people maybe some of whom lead Ivy League universities, to use that kind of thing. And I think universities would be more true to their real purpose. So anyway, so kind of the problems with it. There's a lot of barriers to action, but they're kind of boring. I won't go into those. There's faculty groupthink, there's civility codes, there's tenure, there's administrators, there's alumni and alumni boards who don't seriously look at what institutions are doing, and they should. So what do we do about it? Steve Balch in this book argues that centers like the Ryan Center are very useful, and I think they are somewhat useful in exposing students to different points of view. That said, I don't like them. I like them, but yeah, I know. Well, it's going to those guys. So I've already given you the check, son. So yeah, I do want my $1,000. I think of it. Here's why I think there's a certain danger in that, and it goes way back. When I was a grad student, I was really not a great grad student. I was kind of a smart aleck, and I kind of got bored in grad school because everybody agreed, and I thought that was just so darn boring. So I actually failed my doctoral prelims the first time around. The second time around I passed it, but the first time I failed them. Being a smart aleck can help you get published because you critique everybody else's work, but it can be very bad as a student, at least a graduate student where I went. Although luckily I had a couple of faculty who really protected me, so I survived. And so when I was kind of persona non grata in the department as a grad student, they put me down on the second floor. All the real grad students were up on the 13th floor. I was on the second floor. And I was sharing an office with 2 grad students from African American studies. And we got to be friends and we'd talk a lot. And one of them said, "Do you know that we have the only office in the building that doesn't have a phone? That's how much they trust us," And they were kind of right, The university really didn't like African American studies, didn't care about it, saw it as second rate, treated them badly. And when a lot of people went, it really didn't deserve that. Some did, a lot of them didn't. I think that the strategy of building conservative enclaves on campus is kind of like the women's studies and the black studies strategy, that universities are against us, so we have to hive off our own little corner of them. The problem with that is that little corner becomes a ghetto and nobody takes it seriously. And people might be afraid of it. A conservative group, boy, you can get state legislators mad at us, we better be nice to you. Or black studies, women's studies, oh, you can get women's groups mad at us, we better be nice to you. But nobody really likes them or takes them seriously, and they're not at the center of the university. And nobody from there is going to become university president. And I don't think that's healthy. And I don't think it's fair either to the people who are in those places. And so the argument that I make, and actually it's funny, I work a lot with the deputy provost for diversity at the University of Arkansas. I think the state of Arkansas is 20% black, the university is 6% black. I really don't think that's a good thing. I think we need strategies to get around that. But that said, I don't think it's healthy if we have a bunch of black faculty mentoring black students. I think that it's a mostly white institution. Wouldn't they know more about the place if some white faculty were showing them around? And so similarly, in my academic career, the people who mentored me were liberal Democrats. They were the people who could really show me how things worked, how the institution worked, how to get by. And so that's what I always say to conservatives thinking of going in academia: find a nice liberal who's a good mentor. David over there, somebody like that. Yeah, Steve Channinson. I don't know your politics. I'm just guessing. The second argument is we should strengthen trustees. Trustees and alumni are typically just mouthpieces for university administration. It's probably not healthy. Every group, no matter how smart, needs a watchdog. And it's interesting, when trustees try to play that role, they're usually batted down. Of course, some of them try to do it for bad reasons, like getting their company a university contract or something, or getting their kid in. But at least sometimes trustees and alumni can play a useful role. And it probably is better on the whole if there are more outside voices rather than less, to lessen any academic groupthink. And Ann Neal has a very good chapter on that. By the way, the official association of American University Trustees says that it is not a good idea for university trustees to seek sources of information from outside the college university. That's just silly, right? That's like saying, President Obama, don't seek out any sources of information from outside your administration. Will that make him a better or worse decision maker? That's dumb advice, unless you like groupthink. I think an argument is that more conservatives should infiltrate the academy. But I also think that we need to call on university professors to show that they're tolerant. We have called on university professors, and I think wisely, to say that we're tolerant in matters of race and gender and increasingly sexual orientation, which I kind of think is a good idea on the whole. But we haven't added ideology, even though all the research we've done, and there's a very good chapter here on the psychology of political correctness, suggests that ideology is a much bigger dividing factor than race or gender. So you get a right-wing Republican, and he's fine. He or she is fine with voting for Herman Cain. Whereas they're not fine with voting for Dennis Kucinich. Ideology is actually very important in determining who is one of them and who is one of us. And so I think that I would call on academics to show that you are tolerant of those of different ideologies. You say we should be tolerant of diversity. This is probably the most important diversity there is, especially for colleges and universities. And so I argue for having lots more debates on college campuses. And sort of the final thing I'll say about this, by the way, one cost of this that hasn't been looked at enough, that's a really serious cost. I actually think the bigger cost than undergraduate teaching is that of research, of what research questions we asked. I was at the American Political Science Association a few months back, the annual conference. I love it. It's the highlight of my year. But I thought it was interesting. There must have been, and I meant to count before coming here, and I just ran out of time, but I would guess there were about 15 panels on the Tea Party. And most of them were some variation of trying to figure out if somebody in the Tea Party might be racist. And if you ask that question 100 times, is anybody in the Tea Party a racist? I'm sure that some correlation, I mean, heck, if you just do 100 correlations, one of them is going to be statistically significant. Just by accident, right? If you ask the question 100 ways, at some point you'll get a yes. Next year, I'll see a bunch of panels on the Occupy Wall Street group. And I'll bet none of them ask, are people in the Occupy Wall Street group intolerant? Do they hate business people? Do they hate rich people, whatever? No one will ask that question. Instead, the questions will be, isn't this great, the people organizing, isn't it great part of American democracy and all that? Your ideology determines what kind of questions you ask and how you approach them. And because academia is so to the left, there are some questions we ask and some questions we don't ask. And that is extremely unhealthy for American society. And it really affects our... APSA is a wonderful organization, but they did a big report 3 years back on inequality in America. And it was a stupid report. And if they'd had a couple of conservatives on it, they would have known it's a stupid report. They made a great deal out of relatively minor changes in the distribution of income. They also failed to note, by the way, that the rich are getting richer, a lot richer, but the poor are getting richer too. Poor folks, New York Times just had this a few weeks back, poor Americans have 20% more income than they did 35 years ago, at least they did before the big crunch. And that doesn't count food stamps, it doesn't count welfare, it doesn't count unemployment insurance, it doesn't count all the other parts of the welfare state, it doesn't count progressive taxation, it doesn't count the earned income tax credit. Even not counting all that, poor folks are 20% better off than they were 30 years ago, 35 years ago. That's important. That number needs to be part of the debate. Now, something else, though, that the APSA was missing drastically, is that money probably matters less than how people are treated. 50 or 60 years back, whether you were rich or poor, if we were in a war, your kid would go, but the millionaire's kid might also go and get killed in the war. Guess what? George Herbert Walker Bush was shot down over the South Pacific, almost got killed. John F. Kennedy and some other Princeton and Harvard grads were on PT boats. 1960s Vietnam, that did not happen. We'd become, in that way, a much less equal society. Back in the 40s and 50s, you could be poor and live in a safe neighborhood with good public schools. And your kid wouldn't necessarily get beaten up, and you wouldn't necessarily get shot, and your kid could get a good education. By 1970, that was not true. In Philadelphia, my numbers are old. My numbers are from back in 2001. But back in 2001, if you were an African-American, a 15-year-old African-American male in Philadelphia, you had a 5.5% chance of being murdered, not shot, but murdered by the age of 45. You would be really a lot safer if you volunteered for Iraq and signed up for, Tikrit or Fallujah province or something. Much safer. And yet this is considered acceptable, and the APSA will never do a report on this. Now, New York cut its murder rate by 80-some% in the 1990s. Criminal justice professors have not studied it. Political scientists, by and large, have not studied it. Because of that, if you're a 15-year-old African-American in Brooklyn, you have only a 1.5% chance of being murdered by the time you're 45. I think that's kind of important, right? I think whether you're shot or not, whether your kids can't go outside and play because they might be robbed, that's a real part of whether you're a full human being or not. And people like you and me, we move to the suburbs where we don't have to put up with it. Poor folks don't have those kinds of choices. And I think bringing more conservatives into academia will lead more people to ask those kinds of questions that I think ultimately would lead us to do a better job in solving social problems. There's a lot more I could say on that, but we want to leave time for questions. So.
Thank you.
Thanks.